It was the summer of 1992, a year I'll never forget. I was 24, fresh out of college, and had taken a seasonal job as a park ranger in Pine Ridge National Park. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful, and I enjoyed the quiet serenity of the woods, away from the hustle of the city. Pine Ridge was a vast, dense forest, filled with towering trees and winding trails. The locals believed the forest was old, older than any of us could truly understand. Some said the land had a presence, something watching over it, something that had been there long before people had come along. Most of the time, I brushed it off as local superstition, just stories passed down over generations. After all, I'd spent countless nights patrolling the park, hearing nothing more than the rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. But that summer, something happened that made me rethink everything. It was a warm night in early July. The air was thick with humidity, and the moon was barely a sliver in the sky. I was doing my usual night patrol, walking along one of the longer trails that cut through the denser parts of the forest. It was the kind of night where the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on you, and the trees loomed like dark, silent sentinels. I had my flashlight with me, as always, and a radio clipped to my belt, but I hardly ever used it. Most nights, nothing happened. The park was quiet, and the animals kept to themselves. But this night, something was different. It started small, just a feeling. You know that sensation you get when you're being watched? Like someone's eyes are on you, even when you're alone? That's how it felt. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered close. I kept walking, listening to the crunch of gravel under my boots, but that feeling wouldn't go away. In fact, it got stronger, like whatever was watching me was getting closer. I paused for a moment, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted branches and thick brush. But there was nothing there, just the quiet of the forest. I was about to move on when I saw them. Two red eyes, glowing faintly through the underbrush, watching me. My first thought was that it was some sort of animal, maybe a deer, or even an owl, reflecting the light from my flashlight. But these eyes were different. They weren't at the height of any animal I'd ever seen. They were much higher, and they didn't blink. They just stared. I took a step forward, curious, but the eyes didn't move. They stayed fixed on me, glowing in the darkness like burning coals. My heart began to race, and that uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. I shined the flashlight directly at the eyes, hoping to get a better look at whatever was watching me, but all I could see were those deep red orbs. The light didn't reveal anything else. No fur, no feathers, just those eyes floating in the darkness. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like minutes, but was probably only a few seconds. Then, without warning, the thing moved. It was fast, impossibly fast, darting through the trees like it wasn't even touching the ground. I could hear nothing, no rustling of leaves, no snapping of twigs. It was like the thing didn't make a sound at all. My heart was pounding in my chest as I backed away, trying to keep the flashlight trained on it, but it was gone. Vanished into the forest like a shadow. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe I was letting the isolation of the park get to me. But then I heard it. A low, deep growl, so deep it reverberated in my chest. It sounded like it came from right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight darting through the trees, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. That was enough for me. I turned and ran, sprinting down the trail as fast as I could, my boots slipping on the gravel as I went. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I burst through the door, my supervisor Dave was sitting at the desk half asleep. He looked up at me, startled. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I tried to catch my breath, my words coming out in a rush. "There's something out there. I saw it. It had these red eyes, and it was tall, taller than any animal I've ever seen." Dave frowned, but he didn't look convinced. "Are you sure it wasn't just a deer or something? You know how the light can play tricks on you out there." I shook my head. No, this was different. It wasn't an animal. It moved, too fast, and it didn't make any noise. He stared at me for a long moment, then sighed. "All right, let's go check it out." We grabbed our gear and headed back to the spot where I'd seen the eyes. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just beyond the reach of our flashlights. When we got there, the eyes were gone. But the grass in the clearing was crushed, like something heavy had been standing there. Dave knelt down, inspecting the ground. But there were no footprints, no tracks. Just that eerie, unsettling feeling hanging in the air. We didn't stay long. There was nothing more to see, and Dave chalked it up to my imagination. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. As we walked back to the station, I noticed that Dave kept glancing over his shoulder, like he was expecting something to jump out of the trees. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the old ranger station, every gust of wind, made me jump. The next few nights on patrol were the same. I didn't see the eyes again, but I could feel them, always just out of sight, watching. After my summer at Pine Ridge, I never went back. I told myself it was because I found a better job, but the truth is, I didn't feel safe there anymore. Whatever I saw that night, whatever was lurking in those woods, it wasn't something natural, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out what it wanted. Years later, I still think about that night. I wonder if anyone else has seen those eyes, felt that same sense of dread. I've heard stories, of course, people seeing strange things in the woods, hearing footsteps that aren't there, feeling watched when they're alone. I don't know what it was that I saw. Maybe it was some kind of animal, something we haven't discovered yet. Or maybe it was something else, something older, something that's been in those woods for longer than any of us can imagine. All I know is, I'll never go back to Pine Ridge at night. And if you ever find yourself in those woods, and you feel like something's watching you, run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run. If you think that was unsettling, the next story will chill you to the bone. I've always believed that some places were never meant to be disturbed, that there are corners of the world where things exist beyond our understanding. I'm not talking about ghosts or monsters, at least not in the way most people think. No, this is something far older, something that feels like it's always been here. And if I'm being honest, I wish I could forget what happened that night at Blackwater Lake. But the memory clings to me like a shadow. It was the summer of 1985. I was working as a park ranger in a remote section of a national park out in the Midwest. We had a few lakes in the park, popular with campers and hikers, but Blackwater Lake wasn't one of them. It sat deep in the heart of the park, far from the main trails, surrounded by thick trees and overgrown brush. Most of the locals avoided it, and after what happened, I understood why. People said the lake was cursed. At first, I thought it was just local folklore, the kind of stories that old-timers tell to scare kids or keep tourists from wandering too far off the beaten path. But after that night, I knew there was more to it. My job was pretty simple. Patrol the park, make sure nobody was camping where they shouldn't, check for wildlife disturbances, and keep the peace. We had a few incidents now and then, rowdy teenagers, bear sightings, that sort of thing. Nothing too out of the ordinary. But Blackwater Lake was always different. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. It was a late August evening when it happened. I was on the night shift, driving my truck along the dirt roads that wound through the park. The radio crackled with static, and the headlights carved out a narrow path in the dark. The air was thick with humidity, and the crickets were louder than usual. There was nothing particularly strange about the night, at least not at first. I remember glancing at the clock. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a long, drawn-out howl cutting through the night air like a knife. I slowed the truck, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was just a coyote, maybe a wolf, but something about the sound was off. It was too high-pitched, almost like a scream, and it echoed in a way that made my stomach churn. I pulled over and killed the engine. The forest fell into an uneasy silence, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. The howling came again, but this time it seemed closer. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching under my boots as I made my way toward the sound. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I told myself it was probably just an injured animal. I followed the noise through the trees, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer to the lake, the air grew colder, and I noticed something strange. The crickets had stopped. Everything was still. too still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then, just as I reached the edge of Blackwater Lake, I saw it. Something moving just beneath the surface. At first I thought it was a fish, maybe a beaver or some other animal, but no. This was bigger. Much bigger. The water rippled, but there wasn't any wind. I shone my flashlight over the lake, my hands trembling slightly. For a second, I thought I saw something. Pale, slimy skin and long, thin fingers reaching up from the water, grasping at the air like it was trying to pull itself out. The sight made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The thing, or whatever it was, disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only the ripples behind. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what I had just seen. Then the howling started again, louder this time, and it was coming from the middle of the lake. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that lake as possible, but something kept me rooted to the spot. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. But there was no sense to be made. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to exist. I fumbled for the radio clipped to my belt, my hands shaking. I called it in, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the fear creeping in. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen, so I didn't try. I just told them I needed backup at Blackwater Lake. While I waited, I kept my flashlight trained on the water, half expecting to see that thing rise up again. But the lake was still, eerily so. No more howling, no more movement, just silence. Thick, suffocating silence. When the other rangers arrived, I was still standing at the edge of the lake, my flashlight flickering. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, because they immediately started asking me what happened. I tried to explain, but I couldn't find the right words. How do you tell someone that you saw something in the lake? Something that defied explanation? We searched the area, but there was nothing. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. The lake looked as calm as ever, the water black and still under the moonlight. But I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. The other rangers seemed uneasy, though they wouldn't admit it. After that night, we closed Blackwater Lake to campers. Officially, we said it was due to environmental concerns, but I knew the real reason. Whatever was in that water, it wasn't something we could deal with. Over the years, I've tried to put it out of my mind, to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or that I was overtired and imagining things. But late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear that howling in the back of my mind. And sometimes I dream about the lake, about those long, thin fingers reaching out from the dark water, trying to pull themselves into the world above. I never went back to Blackwater Lake after that night, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left alone. To this day, I don't know what I saw, and maybe I never will. But one thing's for sure, there's something in that lake, something that doesn't belong, and I have a feeling it's still there, waiting just beneath the surface, in the cold, black water, waiting for someone else to come too close. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the next story will prove you wrong. It was the fall of 2001, and I was doing my regular patrol in Cold Hollow, a dense part of the forest in the middle of nowhere. If you've ever been there, you'd know what I'm talking about. The trees are thick, the underbrush is practically alive, and during the day, it can be quite beautiful with the leaves turning orange and red in the crisp autumn air. But even then, there's something about the place that always felt off. People said it was haunted, that strange things happened in the woods at night. But I never put much stock in ghost stories. I'm not that kind of guy. I was a forest ranger, and my job was to make sure no one got lost or hurt in those woods. Simple as that. That particular day, though, I felt a bit on edge. It was hard to explain, but the woods didn't feel right. The air was heavy, the kind of thick, still air that makes everything seem muffled. No birds were chirping, no animals scurrying around, just silence. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing more than the usual weirdness that sometimes comes with being deep in the woods. I parked my truck on the dirt path just outside the thickest part of the forest and started my walk, heading toward the northern ridge. The path was narrow, barely visible through the fallen leaves. My boots crunched beneath me as I went along, checking for any signs of people or trouble. It was just routine, really. I'd done it hundreds of times before. But then I heard it. At first, it was so soft I thought it was just the wind. a faint, almost musical whisper that carried through the trees. I stopped and listened. Nothing. Just that oppressive silence again. I shook my head, probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I kept walking. Then I heard it again. A little louder this time. A whisper. Like someone saying something just out of earshot. It was so faint I couldn't make out the words. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened harder. The wind wasn't blowing, the trees weren't rustling, nothing. I wasn't about to freak myself out, so I pressed on, moving faster. But the further I went, the more I could hear it. Whispers, just behind me, almost as if they were following me. I turned around sharply, shining my flashlight into the trees. No one there, just shadows from the trees, dancing in the dim evening light. I called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No response. My heart started beating a little faster, but I wasn't about to let some spooky whispers scare me. I had a job to do. But then as I walked further into the woods, something strange happened. The whispers, they got louder, clearer, and that's when I heard the words, "Leave." It was unmistakable this time. A clear, low voice, but soft, like it wasn't meant for me to hear. But I had. My skin prickled. It was definitely coming from behind me now. I whipped around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was no one. No sign of anyone hiding, just trees, dark, shadowy trees. "Leave," it said again. I was getting rattled now, but I still tried to convince myself it was some sort of prank. Maybe some kids messing around, hiding in the bushes. That made sense, right? It had to be. But how were they doing it? There wasn't anywhere close by for someone to hide, and I'd been watching the path closely. I should have seen them by now. The whispers, though, they didn't stop. They just kept coming, more insistent. "Leave. Get out." I don't scare easily, but this was starting to feel wrong, like really wrong. I turned around again, shining the light in every direction, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't see anything. Yet the whispers, they were all around me, like the trees themselves were speaking. That's when I noticed the shadows. They weren't normal. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw them move. Between the trees, quick, too quick, and they weren't just normal shadows. They were dark, darker than they should have been, even with the dimming light. They flickered in and out, like they didn't belong there. They slithered, almost like they were alive, moving closer and closer. But there was nothing casting them. No figures, no people, just shadows. My chest tightened. This wasn't right. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I had to get out of there. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what those shadows were. I turned and started walking fast, my feet kicking up the leaves as I went. The whispers were getting louder now, closer. I could feel them, like a breath on the back of my neck. The shadows were moving faster too, darting between the trees, closing in on me. My hands were trembling, and I could barely hold the flashlight straight. Then I heard it, right next to my ear. "Leave. Now." I bolted. I don't know if I've ever run that fast in my life. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted back toward my truck. The whispers were all around me now, the shadows darting between the trees, too fast to be human. I didn't stop. I couldn't. It felt like they were right behind me, like if I slowed down for even a second, they'd catch me. I reached my truck, yanked open the door, and slammed it shut. My hands fumbled with the keys, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might burst. I finally jammed the key into the ignition and peeled out of there, dirt and leaves flying as I sped down the narrow path, not stopping until I reached the station. When I got there, I sat in the truck for a long time, just trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain it. I never went back to Cold Hollow at night after that. I couldn't. The whispers, those shadows, I don't know what they were, but they didn't want me there. I don't scare easy, but whatever that was, it wasn't something I was willing to argue with. To this day, I can't explain it. I've told a few people, but they just laugh it off, say I was tired, or that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I'm not going back to find out what it really was. Cold Hollow, it feels alive, and I think it wants to stay that way. That was just the beginning. Now brace yourself for what's coming next. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 3 decades now. It's a job that comes with its fair share of strangeness, especially when you spend as much time alone in the woods as I have. You hear a lot of stories, people seeing things they can't explain, hearing sounds they swear aren't natural. For the most part, I chalked those up to fear or exhaustion. But in 1997, I experienced something I'll never forget. It's the one thing that, even now, I can't explain. I don't tell the story often because I'm still not sure what to make of it myself, but when I do, I always start with this. What happened that day in Iron Ridge is real. I remember that summer being hot, the kind of sweltering heat that made your clothes stick to you and turned the air heavy. Iron Ridge was one of the more isolated areas in the park. Not many people ventured that way unless they were serious hikers or rock climbers. The terrain was rough, steep cliffs, jagged rocks, and deep caves that had been carved into the mountains over centuries. Beautiful, sure, but not exactly a beginner's hike. It was mid-July when we got the call. A group of 4 hikers had gone missing in Iron Ridge. They'd been out there for 2 days and hadn't returned. At first, I wasn't too concerned. People get lost all the time. Most of the time, they show up hours later, embarrassed but unharmed. But as the hours turned into days, worry set in. I was assigned to a search team. There were 5 of us, including me, 2 rangers and 3 volunteers. We drove out to Iron Ridge in the early morning, hoping to cover as much ground as we could before the sun hit its peak. When we arrived at the trailhead, the first thing we noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just silence. It was eerie, but I figured it was just the tension of the situation getting to me. We set off up the trail, calling out the hikers, names as we went, scanning the area for any sign of them. After about an hour, we found their campsite. It was tucked away in a small clearing, almost hidden by the trees. Their tents were still up, their gear untouched. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that they'd packed up and left in a hurry. It was like they just walked away in the middle of whatever they were doing. That's when things started to feel off. The air around the campsite was cold. I know that doesn't sound strange, but considering it was the middle of summer and the sun was beating down on us, it didn't make any sense. It was the kind of cold that gets under your skin, makes you shiver, even when you're sweating. One of the volunteers, a guy named Mike, commented on it too. He joked that it felt like someone had walked over his grave. We all laughed it off, but there was a nervous edge to it. The only place they could have gone was the caves. Iron Ridge was famous for them, long, winding tunnels that stretched deep into the mountains. Some of them were mapped out, but most weren't. They were dangerous too. If you didn't know where you were going, it was easy to get turned around. And once you were lost in there, it was almost impossible to find your way out. We didn't want to go into the caves, but we didn't have a choice. If the hikers had gone in there, we needed to find them before it was too late. So, we grabbed our flashlights and headed inside. I've never liked caves. The darkness feels different in there, thicker, almost alive. Every sound echoes, making it impossible to tell where it's coming from. As we moved deeper, the temperature dropped even more. I could see my breath in front of me, and it felt like the walls were closing in. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt, like something was watching us from just out of sight. After about an hour of walking, we started seeing strange markings on the walls. At first, I thought they were scratches from an animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion, but the more I looked at them, the more I realized they were too big, too deep. They looked like claw marks, but whatever had made them had claws bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. We pressed on, the tension growing with every step. And then we found them, the hikers. They were huddled together at the back of a cave, their backs pressed against the wall like they were trying to melt into the stone. Their eyes were wide with terror, their bodies shaking. They were alive, but barely. I'd seen people scared before, but this was different. This was a fear that had hollowed them out, left them broken. One of the hikers, a woman named Sarah, managed to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper, and it trembled with every word. "It came from the dark," she said. I asked her what she meant, but she just kept repeating the same thing over and over. It came from the dark. None of the other hikers would talk. They just stared at us, eyes wide, as if they were still seeing whatever it was that had terrified them. We decided to get them out of there as quickly as possible. As we turned to leave, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and its arms were impossibly long, stretching out toward us. Its face, or rather, the place where its face should have been, was blank. Just pale, smooth skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Not blinked, and it was gone. We didn't waste any time getting out of the cave. We practically dragged the hikers back to the campsite, and as soon as we were outside, the cold vanished. The sun was still shining, the air was warm again, but none of us felt any better. We sealed the cave that afternoon. I don't know what we saw in there, and I don't want to know. Whatever it wasn't natural, and it wasn't something we were supposed to find. Every now and then I think about that day, about what might still be lurking in the dark, deep inside Iron Ridge. I've told this story a few times, but most people don't believe me. They think it's just another park ranger story, something we tell to scare the tourists. But I know what I saw, and I'll never go back to that cave. If that last tale made you uneasy, this next one will keep you awake at night. I'll never forget the night of 1990 at Silver Falls. It was a chilly October evening, the kind where the wind seemed to carry whispers through the trees. I was 24 years old, working as a park ranger, a job I loved for its solitude and connection to nature. Silver Falls was my territory, its deep forests, rugged trails, and thundering waterfalls. At night, though, it took on a different feel, almost like it was alive in a way I couldn't fully explain. That night, I was on my usual patrol. I'd done the route 100 times before, making sure no campers were out past curfew, and checking that all was quiet. It was mostly routine, nothing out of the ordinary. The wind rustled the trees, and the sound of rushing water from the falls was constant, a calming backdrop to the night. Then I heard it. At first it was faint, almost like a distant animal call. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, sharper. It wasn't an animal. It was a scream, high-pitched, shrill, and unlike anything I had ever heard before. It echoed through the trees, bouncing off the rocks and filling the air around me. My stomach dropped. Someone had to be in danger. I took off running, heart pounding in my chest, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I made my way through the dense undergrowth. The scream came again, more desperate this time. My mind raced. What could be happening? Was it an accident? An attack? Every instinct in my body was screaming to hurry. I reached the edge of the trail that led down to the falls. The moon was full that night, casting an eerie glow on the rushing water below. But there was no one there. Just the sound of the falls, louder than I'd ever noticed before, like they were trying to drown out the scream that had just pierced the night. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone out there?" My voice felt small in the vastness of the park. There was no response. The only answer was the wind as it howled through the trees, making the leaves rustle like whispers from unseen figures. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something wasn't right. I scanned the area with my flashlight, sweeping it across the rocks and trees, half expecting to see someone in trouble. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone. My hand shook a little as I held the light steady. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe the shadows from the trees. But then I saw it again, a figure standing at the very edge of the falls, pale and thin, almost blending into the mist from the water. My breath caught in my throat. The figure's arms were unnaturally long, dangling at its sides, and its mouth was wide open. It was as if it was screaming, but no sound came out. I froze. My mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't look human, at least not entirely. But there was something about its stance, its shape, that felt familiar. Too familiar. I blinked and the figure was gone. Just like that. The falls kept roaring, the wind kept blowing, but the figure had vanished into thin air. My heart was racing and my breath was coming in short, ragged bursts. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks on me? But that scream? I hadn't imagined that. I could still hear it, ringing in my ears as if it was imprinted in my brain. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where the figure had been. But nothing happened. No more screams, no movement, just the relentless sound of water crashing against the rocks below. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from the falls as possible. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and walked, then jogged, then flat out ran back to the ranger station. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear that scream again or to see that figure lurking in the shadows. But the only sound was my footsteps crunching on the dirt trail. When I finally made it back, I locked the door behind me and sat down, my hands still shaking. I told myself it was just the wind, just the stress of the job, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure, pale, long-limbed, its mouth open in a silent scream. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told my supervisor about what I had heard and seen. He listened, but he didn't seem concerned. "Probably just some campers messing around," he said. "You know how the sound of the falls can distort things, especially at night." I nodded, but I knew it wasn't that simple. In the weeks that followed, I avoided night patrols whenever I could. I stuck to the daylight, where everything seemed normal, where the falls were just another part of the park's natural beauty. But even during the day, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. I never did, but I never forgot it either. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear that scream. Every time I think of Silver Falls, it echoes in my mind, haunting and unanswered. And I still wonder, what was it that I saw that night? Was it real? Or was it something else? Something beyond my understanding? I guess I'll never know. But one thing's for sure. I'll never go back to Silver Falls at night. Not after that. And if you ever find yourself there, standing at the edge of the falls, listening to the wind through the trees, just be careful, you might hear it too. The fear only grows stronger from here. Let's dive into the next haunting tale. It was the summer of 2004, and I was working my third year as a park ranger in Cedarwood Forest, a vast stretch of woods that, despite its beauty, always had a certain air of mystery about it. The trees were thick and tall, casting long shadows even in the brightest daylight, and at night, the forest felt like an entirely different world. But I loved it. I had grown up in a small town nearby, so Cedarwood was familiar to me, a place of childhood hikes and camping trips. It was peaceful, for the most part. At least, it used to be. The park wasn't a hot spot for tourists. We'd get the occasional family looking for a quiet place to spend the weekend, and some experienced hikers passing through. But it was nothing like the big national parks. That suited me just fine. I preferred the quiet. My job was to keep an eye on things, make sure campers stayed safe, check the trails, and ensure nobody got lost. Pretty standard stuff. But there was one part of the job that I wasn't too fond of, the night shifts. Now, don't get me wrong, I wasn't scared of the dark or anything. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that most of the noises at night were just animals going about their business. But there was something about Cedarwood at night that felt different. It was hard to explain. Maybe it was the way the wind moved through the trees or how quiet everything could get, but sometimes it felt like the forest was watching you. Sounds crazy, I know, but if you'd spent as much time out there as I had, you'd know what I mean. One evening, late in July, I was finishing up a shift that had started in the afternoon. The sun had set and the last bits of daylight were fading behind the hills. I was in the ranger station, going over the day's logs when the radio crackled to life. "Hey Mark, you there?" It was Jess, another ranger working in a different part of the forest. "Yeah, what's up?" Setting down my pen. "We just got a report from a camper," she said, her voice sounding a bit uneasy. "They said they saw a campfire deep in the woods, past the designated campsites. You want to check it out?" "Campfire? Shouldn't be anyone out there this late," I said, frowning. We had strict rules about where campers could set up, and nobody was supposed to be out in the middle of the woods after dark, especially not outside the marked areas. I sighed, grabbing my flashlight. "All right, I'll go take a look." "Be careful," Jess added, her tone making me pause for a second. They said it looked weird, like not right. I didn't think much of her comment at the time. Weird campfires weren't exactly uncommon. People do stupid things in the woods when they're not paying attention. I figured it was just some kids messing around or someone trying to camp off the beaten path. I left the station, the air cool and crisp against my skin. The trail to the area where the camper had seen the fire wasn't far, but it wasn't an official path either. It was one of those old, unmarked trails that the locals knew about. but we didn't advertise to the public. Not a place anyone should be wandering at night, but people have a way of finding the hidden spots, especially the curious types. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the sounds of the night filled the air, crickets chirping, the distant hoot of an owl, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost enough to make me forget why I was out there in the first place. But then, as I turned a bend in the trail, I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. It wasn't like any campfire I'd seen before. The light was too bright, almost unnatural, and there was something odd about the way it flickered. I quickened my pace, my heart beating a little faster, though I couldn't say why. As I got closer, the trees thinned, and I stepped into a small clearing. The fire was there, all right, a bright orange flame burning steadily in the center of the clearing. But something was wrong. There was no sound, no crackling of wood, no popping from the fire, just silence. And then I noticed the figures. They were sitting around the fire, at least 5 of them. At first, I thought they were people, campers maybe, but they weren't moving, not an inch. They just sat there, staring into the flames, completely still. I shone my flashlight at them, but the light didn't seem to affect them at all. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I took a step closer, squinting to get a better look. The figures were blurry, like they were out of focus. I thought maybe it was the smoke from the fire playing tricks on my eyes, but there wasn't any smoke. I moved closer still, my heart pounding now. "Hey!" I called out, my voice louder than I intended. No response, not even a twitch. I took another step and then another until I was only a few feet away. I reached out with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when it happened. The figures vanished, just like that. 1 second they were there, and the next they were gone, like smoke blown away by the wind. The fire, too, snuffed out in an instant, leaving me standing in complete darkness, my flashlight the only source of light in the clearing. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. It couldn't have been real. There was no way. But as I looked down at the ground where the fire had been, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Ashes. Cold, black ashes, as if the fire had been burning for hours. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I turned and walked back to the station as fast as my legs would carry me, my heart pounding the whole way. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Not Jess, not the other rangers. I figured no one would believe me anyway. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. But here's the thing. I'm not the only one who's seen it. Over the years, other campers have reported seeing that same fire deep in the woods. They say it's always the same, a bright, silent fire with figures sitting around it, unmoving. And just like me, when they get too close, it all disappears, leaving nothing but cold ashes. I've told every camper I've spoken to since then the same thing. If you see a fire in the woods at night and it doesn't sound right, stay away. Don't go near it. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to find out, and neither should you. You might think you've heard it all, but this next story will make you question everything. It was the summer of 1993, and Hollow Creek had always been a quiet little town. A bit too quiet, if you ask me. Not much ever happened here. No big news, no major incidents, just a place where you could live your life peacefully and never make the headlines. At least, that's what I thought. I was working as a junior officer back then, fresh out of the academy, and Hollow Creek seemed like the perfect place to get my feet wet without dealing with the high stakes of a big city. I was assigned foot patrols around town, and my route often took me along Hollow Creek itself, a narrow, winding stream that ran through the woods on the outskirts. People in town used to say the place was haunted, but I chalked it up to small-town gossip, the kind of stories you'd tell around a campfire just to get a rise out of the younger kids. I wasn't the type to scare easily, especially not by stories of strange figures or mysterious sounds. That night was no different. I remember it clearly, because it was one of those humid summer evenings where the air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the mosquitoes were relentless. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the forest was starting to cast long shadows. It was my last patrol of the day, and I was ready to wrap up and head home. I had just turned the corner near the old wooden bridge that spanned Hollow Creek when I saw something. At first, it didn't strike me as odd, It looked like a person standing on the opposite bank, maybe 50 or 60 feet away. The figure was tall, and I mean tall. Taller than any normal person. My first thought was that it was a hiker or someone who had wandered too far off the trail. But something didn't sit right. The figure wasn't moving. It just stood there, completely still, facing the creek. I called out, "Hey, everything all right over there?" No response. The figure didn't even flinch. It was like they hadn't heard me, but I knew they had to. The night was dead quiet, and my voice carried across the water easily. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure was dressed in all black, or at least that's what it looked like from where I stood. The fading light made it hard to tell for sure. I took a few steps forward, but something inside me screamed to stop. That's when I noticed it. There were no features. No face, no eyes, no mouth. Just darkness. Like a shadow, but solid. It didn't make sense. The air around me felt heavy, colder than it should have been for a summer night. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. My instincts as a cop told me to approach, to figure out what I was dealing with, but something deeper, something primal, told me to stay where I was, and then it moved. Not like a person moves, though. It didn't walk. It glided, almost like it was floating, but its feet, or whatever they were, never touched the ground. It crossed the creek in a single, smooth motion, heading toward the woods on the far side. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I should have gone after it. I should have called for backup, but I didn't. I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as the figure disappeared into the trees. I don't know how long I stood there after it was gone. Minutes, maybe more. Eventually, I snapped out of it and radioed in to dispatch, but I didn't know what to say. Tall, dark figure sounded ridiculous, even to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just seen something I wasn't supposed to. Over the next few weeks, I heard other stories, people claiming they'd seen the same thing near the creek. Always at dusk, always watching from a distance. Some said it was a ghost, others said it was something darker, something not of this world. I wasn't the only one who'd seen it, but no one could explain it. The reports all described the same thing. Tall, dark, faceless, watching. I never went back to that part of the creek after dark. I didn't need to. Whatever I saw that night, I had no intention of seeing it again. But here's the thing. No one ever gets close to it. No one dares to. And that's what keeps me up at night. It's still out there, watching. Waiting. And I don't think it's done yet. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it. I still patrol the area, but I keep my distance from the creek. Occasionally we'll get a call from someone new to town, a hiker or a camper, claiming they saw something strange by the water. I don't need to ask for details. I know what they saw. I never tell them the whole story. I just say it's probably their imagination, or maybe the shadows playing tricks on them in the fading light. But deep down, I know better. Whatever it is, it's still out there. I can feel it. And one day, someone will get too close. I just hope I'm not on duty when that happens. If you weren't scared before, the next story will change that. I'm not usually one for telling ghost stories, but this one, well, it's not really a ghost story. It's something else. It happened back in 2006, a year I won't soon forget. To this day, I still get a chill whenever I think about it, and it all started in Fox Hollow. Now, if you've never heard of Fox Hollow, I wouldn't be surprised. It's just a quiet patch of woods a few miles outside of town. Nothing much happens there, and that's the way we like it. It's the kind of place you'd drive through without a second glance. But something about that year, it just wasn't right. I was working the late shift as a park ranger at the time. Not a glamorous job by any means, but it paid the bills and I enjoyed the peace and quiet that came with being out in nature. Usually, I'd be the only one out there during the night shifts, making sure no one was up to mischief or getting lost in the woods. That all changed one evening when I got a call about some strange lights being seen over Fox Hollow. It wasn't the first time we'd had a report like that, but it was the first one I'd gotten in months. I figured it was probably just some kids playing around with flashlights, or maybe a car's headlights reflecting weirdly through the trees. Still, it was my job to check it out. I remember it was a clear, chilly night. You know, the kind of night where you can see every star in the sky, and the air has that crisp, clean smell. I grabbed my flashlight and hopped into the ranger truck, driving out towards the hollow. As I got closer, I noticed that the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves, seemed to fade away. It was unnaturally quiet. I parked the truck at the edge of the woods and started walking in, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just trees, shadows, and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. The lights. They weren't like flashlights or lanterns or anything man-made. These were glowing orbs, floating just above the treetops, moving slowly like they were searching for something. At first, there were only a few, but as I watched, more appeared. They moved in sync, like they were part of some kind of formation. I stood there, frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I've heard of ball lightning before, but this didn't look like any kind of natural phenomenon. The lights didn't flicker or spark. They just glowed steadily, almost like they were alive. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started following them. They seemed to move away as I got closer, always staying just out of reach. I'd shine my flashlight in their direction, but it didn't make a difference. The light from my torch was nothing compared to the strange soft glow of those orbs. I walked deeper into the woods, following them for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The deeper I went, the more the air around me felt heavy, like the atmosphere itself was pressing down on me. The woods around me seemed darker than they should have been, even for nighttime. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights vanished. I stopped dead in my tracks, shining my flashlight around, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. For a moment I thought maybe it was over, that whatever those lights were, they were gone. But then I realized something. I wasn't alone. It's hard to describe the feeling. It wasn't like hearing a noise or seeing a shadow. It was more like a presence. I could feel something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and my skin prickled with cold. I turned slowly, half trying to see if there was anyone or anything behind me, but the woods were empty. At least, they looked empty. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head. But then I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so faint, I couldn't make out any words, but it was definitely there, just at the edge of my hearing. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but still, nothing. Just that overwhelming sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. Then, out of the silence came a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a laugh, but not a normal laugh. It was distorted, echoing through the trees like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It was a deep, guttural sound, filled with malice, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to that awful sound. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. Time seemed to stretch and warp in that place. But eventually the laugh stopped, and the woods fell silent once more. That was enough for me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away from whatever was out there. I don't remember much of the run back, only that by the time I reached the truck, I was gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't want to. I didn't want to see if those lights had returned, or worse, if something else was following me. I never told anyone what happened that night, not the full story anyway. When people asked, I just said I didn't find anything, that it was probably a prank or some kind of weird atmospheric effect. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. The lights still show up from time to time. People report seeing them, floating over the treetops just like before. Some have even tried to follow them like I did, but no one's ever gotten close enough to figure out what they are. And no one else has heard that laugh. At least, not that they've admitted. I don't go near Fox Hollow anymore, not at night. Whatever those lights are, whatever they're looking for, I want no part of it. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about that presence I felt in the woods. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting, watching. I don't know what it is, I don't think I ever will, but I'm sure of one thing. It didn't want me there. The shadows get darker with every story, and the next one is the darkest yet. It was a chilly October evening in 1988, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to let go, no matter how many layers you wear. I was working as a ranger at Misty Valley, a small, quiet park tucked away in the mountains. The place was known for its dense fog, the kind that blanketed everything, making the world seem smaller, more isolated. People came from all over to hike during the day, take in the eerie beauty of the valley, and then camp overnight to experience the strange and ethereal atmosphere. But they didn't know the valley like I did. That night started like any other. I was stationed alone in the small ranger's cabin near the entrance of the park, sipping on a cup of instant coffee and flipping through an old magazine. The radio was silent, which was a little odd but not entirely unusual. Weeknights were quiet in the valley. Most visitors came on the weekends, and even then, the number of people willing to camp overnight was small. Most folks were unnerved by the fog, especially when it rolled in after dark, but I'd grown used to it. In fact, I found it kind of peaceful. Around 10 p.m., the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the cabin. I glanced outside, expecting to see the usual fog rolling in off the mountains. Sure enough, the mist was thickening, swirling lazily around the trees like a living thing. I didn't think much of it at first. Misty Valley was known for this kind of weather. Then, out of nowhere, the door to the cabin burst open. I jumped, spilling my coffee as a man stumbled inside. He looked like he'd been running for miles. His face was pale, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes... God, I'll never forget the look in his eyes. Wild, panicked, like a trapped animal. He collapsed into the nearest chair, gasping for breath, his chest heaving with every intake. "Help me," he managed to choke out between ragged breaths. I quickly grabbed my first aid kit, thinking he'd been attacked by an animal or maybe fallen and hurt himself. But as I got closer, I realized there were no visible injuries. His hands trembled as he clutched the armrests of the chair, and sweat poured down his face despite the cold. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. "Did you get lost?" "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something was following me." I frowned. "A bear? A mountain lion?" He shook his head violently, his eyes wide with terror. No, it wasn't an animal. It was something else, big but quiet. Too quiet. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the way he said it, like whatever had chased him wasn't just some ordinary predator. I'd dealt with plenty of hikers who'd scared themselves silly after getting lost in the woods or hearing a branch snap in the distance. But this was different. He was genuinely terrified. "Okay," I said, trying to stay calm for his sake. "Let's get you warmed up. We'll figure it out." I handed him a blanket and poured him a cup of water. He took it with shaking hands, but didn't drink. His eyes kept darting toward the window, like he was expecting something to burst through at any moment. "What exactly did you see?" I asked, keeping my tone as even as possible. He swallowed hard, then leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in the fog. I could barely see it at first, but then it got closer." He paused, glancing toward the window again. It had eyes, glowing eyes, huge, and the fog, it wasn't just moving around it, it was moving with it, like the fog was part of it. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I'd heard some weird stories from campers over the years, but this was something else. "Where did this happen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "By the lake," he whispered. "I was setting up my tent, and I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was footsteps, heavy footsteps. But when I looked around, there was nothing there, just the fog." He took a shaky breath. "And then I saw it. It was huge. Bigger than any animal I've ever seen. It didn't make sense. Something that big should have been loud, but it was so quiet, like it was part of the mist." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reassure him, tell him he was just spooked by the fog and the isolation of the valley. But another part of me, the part that had grown up in these mountains, that knew the strange stories passed down by old-timers about the valley, wasn't so sure. "I'll go check it out," I said, grabbing my flashlight and radio. "You stay here." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't go out there," he whispered. "It's still out there. I know it." I forced a smile, though I wasn't feeling particularly confident. I'll be careful. The truth was, I didn't want to go out there either, but it was my job, and if there really was something dangerous lurking in the fog, I needed to find out what it was. I stepped outside, immediately greeted by the thick, swirling mist. The temperature had dropped even more, and the fog was so dense that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog but revealing nothing but the empty woods. I made my way toward the lake, the cold air biting at my skin. The fog was heavier here, clinging to the trees like a thick blanket. Every step felt like I was walking deeper into something unnatural. The silence was oppressive, the only sound my own footsteps crunching on the gravel path. And then I heard it. A low, deep growl. Not the kind of growl you'd hear from a bear or a mountain lion. This was different. It was deeper, more guttural, and it seemed to come from all around me, as if the fog itself was growling. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but all I could see was the swirling mist. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something big, hulking, just barely visible through the fog. I turned the flashlight toward it, but it disappeared into the mist, moving silently despite its size. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. I could feel it. Something primal, something that didn't belong in this world. The growling grew louder, closer, and the fog seemed to shift, moving in unnatural patterns around me. I caught another glimpse of it. A massive figure with glowing eyes, its shape indistinct, but terrifyingly large. It was moving toward me, slowly, deliberately, as if it was toying with me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The fog seemed to close in around me, thickening with every step. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the blood rushing in my ears and the distant growl that seemed to follow me no matter how fast I ran. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, I was gasping for breath, my hands shaking. The man was still sitting in the chair, his eyes wide with fear. "You saw it, didn't you?" he whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I knew was that whatever was out there in the fog, it wasn't natural. And I wasn't about to go back to find out what it was. That night, the fog lingered longer than usual, hanging over the valley like a shroud. I sat in the cabin, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open again, expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. But the fog eventually lifted, and the sun rose, casting light on the valley once more. The man left the next morning without saying another word. I never saw him again. I still work at Misty Valley, but I never go near the lake at night. And when the fog rolls in thick like it did that night, I make sure to stay inside, where it's safe. Whatever I saw or didn't see out there in the mist, I don't want to meet it again. And if you ever find yourself in Misty Valley, camping near the lake, and the fog starts to roll in thick, I suggest you pack up and leave, because whatever's out there, it's still waiting. You've survived this far, but the next story might be your breaking point. It was summer of 1999, a time when I was much younger and far more adventurous than I am now. I lived in a small town near a state park, a place where the forest stretched for miles, and if you wandered far enough, you'd eventually find Raven Rock, a towering cliff that overlooked the valley below. People called it beautiful, but to me, there was always something eerie about it. Maybe it was the way the wind howled as it passed through the trees, or the way the shadows would stretch long and dark as the sun started to set. I didn't go there often, but when I did, I never went alone. That year, a hiker named Tom disappeared near Raven Rock. The local search and rescue team combed the forest for days. They searched the trails, the ravines, the thick underbrush, but there was no sign of him. Not a footprint, not a broken branch. Nothing. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. I remember hearing the news and feeling a shiver run down my spine. People didn't just disappear like that. Not here. The days went on and the search was eventually called off. They said he was probably lost, maybe fell somewhere they hadn't looked, but I wasn't so sure. I didn't know Tom personally, but I had seen him around. He was experienced, knew the area well. It didn't make sense that he would just get lost. A week or so after the search ended, I found myself drawn to the park, to Raven Rock. I don't know why. Maybe I was hoping to find something that the others had missed. Or maybe I just needed to see the place for myself. It was early evening, and the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I walked the familiar trail that led to the cliff. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The trees seemed taller, darker, as if they were closing in around me. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but the knot in my stomach wouldn't go away. When I finally reached Raven Rock, I stood there for a while, looking out over the valley. The sky was a mix of orange and purple, the last rays of sunlight painting the landscape in a strange, otherworldly glow. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow moving across the rock face. But then it moved again. Slowly, deliberately. It was large, much larger than any animal I'd ever seen, and its limbs were long, spindly, like the legs of a spider. It crawled along the side of the cliff with a strange, almost mechanical grace, its body blending into the shadows, but just enough visible that I knew it wasn't my imagination. My heart raced, and for a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at this thing as it made its way along the rock. It didn't seem to notice me, or maybe it did, and it just didn't care. I don't know what came over me, but I felt an overwhelming urge to get closer, to see it up close. Maybe I thought I could figure out what it was, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that it was real. I took a step forward, then another, my eyes never leaving the creature as it crawled along the rock face. But as soon as I moved, it stopped. It froze in place, as if it knew I was watching. For a few seconds, everything was still. I held my breath, waiting to see what it would do. Then, without warning, it darted into one of the cracks in the rock, moving faster than anything I had ever seen. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had disappeared, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, half expecting it to come back, but it didn't. The forest around me was still and silent, as if nothing had happened at all. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I turned and made my way back down the trail, my legs shaking beneath me. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. Who would believe me? Even now, as I write this, I'm not sure if I believe it myself. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever it wasn't natural. The next day, I went back to the park, hoping to find some kind of explanation. I walked the same trail, stood in the same spot, but everything was normal. There was no sign of the creature, no strange shadows, nothing. Tom was never found. His family eventually gave up hope, and the park went back to normal. But every time I pass by Raven Rock, I can't help but feel that unease creeping back in. I don't go there anymore. Not after what I saw. Some people say the park is cursed, that Raven Rock is haunted. I don't know about that. All I know is that something is out there, something that doesn't belong in our world. And whatever it is, it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Maybe one day someone will figure out what happened to Tom. Maybe they'll find a clue, or maybe they'll see what I saw. But until then, I'll keep my distance. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.